Acts 20, 1 to 3, and Romans 1. Well, we drop into Acts just long enough to give us the setting for the book of Romans. Chapter 20, verses 2 and 3. When he had gone over to that region and encouraged them, he came to Greece and stayed there 3 months, apparently in Corinth, we realize from Romans 16. And then he realizes there's a plot against his life, and he heads back through Macedonia. So the point is, Paul is in his third missionary journey. The year is about 57. He has never been to Rome, and he's settled in Corinth for about 3 months, and he decides to write a letter to a group of people that he had never met, but he knew that they were trying to establish a church of Jew and Gentile there in the capital of the empire, and he was planning on meeting them at some point. So that's the very quick background to how Paul comes to write Romans. We need to ask for this letter specifically how to approach the book because of the reputation it has. It is the lead book of Paul's 13 books in the sense that it always has been considered the first in our Bibles, the canonical order. Begins with Romans. Why is that? Basically because it's the longest of his books that we have, and also its primary importance. Well, since the 1500s, the period of the Reformation, most theologians or commentators have interpreted Romans as the most theological of Paul's letters. And what we mean by that is this letter, above all the others, has been taken as Paul's authoritative summary of Christian doctrine. And what I mean by that then would be, just items like selected topics like law, human sinfulness, faith versus works, God's righteousness, predestination, eternal security, justification. Ideas that, like in a textbook, you would go to the book of Romans and find verses to support your view on different things. Like the Romans Road, you may have heard of that. That's using Paul's letter of Romans like a textbook. Well, I'm going to recommend a different approach very briefly here because, again, of how I just think it doesn't sound like a textbook the way we think of textbooks today, but instead, if we follow through on our biblical story, I think there's another way to take the book that just makes more sense. First of all, Paul had not experienced all there was to know about the Christian faith, and if we were to ask him if he was a theologian, I think he would balk at that word. I think he saw himself as a lay minister, someone who, as a tent maker, he knew he was called to spread the word of Gentile inclusion to the West, as the apostles stayed in Jerusalem. But he was more of a storyteller, a story knower, a participant in the greatest story of humanity. And that's how he saw himself and what he was telling. So I just think the word theology would not be the one he would grab at. What Paul did know, of course, was the Old Testament, and he knew it very well. Of the 89 references to the Old Testament that Paul makes throughout his 13 letters, 51 of the references are in Romans. And so Paul is going to be centering his attention on how the Old Testament story, again, remember it goes back to Abraham, goes through David, travels through Israel's past. Paul was convinced that God had made a promise to Israel that could not be broken. For if it could be broken, then he could also break other promises coming up. So Paul is convinced, and I think he realizes the necessity of this idea, that if we have a promise in the Old Testament, it must stick. It cannot be broken. Secondly, Paul knew and had met Jesus and had been specially commissioned by Jesus to become the apostle to the Gentiles. Again, as the apostles of Jesus stayed in Jerusalem or in Judea, Paul is going to head west and become the primary spokesman for Jesus to the Gentile world. And then speaking of Gentiles, Paul is, again, centering in this book his attention on a small group. We think about 150 people in Rome, mostly Gentile, we think, as far as a proportion between Jew and Gentile. Strong, maybe minority of Jews, but many, many Gentiles, probably majority. And we hear at the end of the book of Romans that they are struggling with their unity. So if we take the end of the book as pushing the theme of Paul, where he's going with his argument, we want to get the people of Rome into the theme of Romans as much as we can. So putting it together, I'm recommending that he would trade out the word theology textbook for comparing and tying together the three stories of the Old Testament, Jesus, and the people of Rome. If you take these three ideas together, I think from here you come up with the book of Romans. He was taking three stories and laying them end to end, even on top of each other, making connections that this Gentile majority audience could understand. This is from a book called The Story of Romans by Catherine Grebe. In Paul's view, a great deal depends on whether they will quit fighting among themselves and rise to the occasion of being a base of operations for Paul and his co-workers in the next chapter of God's story. Paul is nervous about where the Roman people are in their understanding of the gospel. So we can't take that out of this story of Romans, which is to happen in Spain once Paul delivers the funds he has been collecting for the Jerusalem church. Romans was written so that the gospel of God would have an effect on the Romans as it had its effect on Paul. When that happens, Paul believes the story will come out right. So the story is being written even as Paul notices how the people in Rome will understand these two stories and the effect that it's supposed to have on them. Well, let's get to Romans 1 quickly. My opinion of the theme of Romans, I wrote this in my Bible a long time ago, just above the word Romans in my margin. God, in other words, I finished reading the book at one point, and I wrote this in as a first blush opinion as to what the theme was about. God has been and still is consistent in justifying the Gentiles as Gentiles. God is being consistent even in this story and in this story of making this guy right here, let's pretend he's a Gentile and these are Jews, he's allowing him to become justified even as a Gentile. I think that's what the book of Romans is about. And that's seen in the opening of the book, 1:4 through 7. Jesus was declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection of the dead. Through him we have received favor and apostleship for obedience to the faith among all nations including Jews and Gentiles, for his name, among whom also you are called. You are the called of Jesus Christ to all who are in Rome, loved of God, called to be saints. Many of them are not Jewish, and so I'd say that called to be is the way that God is calling Gentiles into the family. They're called to be holy ones. 1:16 and 17, famous verses. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It's the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. For the Jew first, the story starts with them, and also for the Greek. For in it the propriety of God being just in letting Gentiles stay Gentiles, for in it the propriety of God is revealed from faith to faith. Whether it's that bouncing ball of faith here to faith here, faithfulness of Jesus, or the faith of each of these, from faith to faith to faith, as it is written, and he quotes Habakkuk 2, the just shall live by faith. The second half of Romans 1, of course, tells the story of the problem of human sinfulness. I think that's too broad, though. I think what he's trying to explain is the worship problem that had developed in the story of Israel. So Romans 1 is going to go back and tell this story in its downfall, shall we say. 1:20 and 21. Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Because though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God. So they knew this God through Torah, but they made a huge mistake. Verse 23, they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, to birds, four-footed beasts, and creeping things. That's a quote from Psalm 106:20 that says they changed their glory into the image of an ox that eats grass. So we're hearing Paul retell the story of Sinai at the end of Romans 1. Well, what happens when a person worships the wrong Elohim or Theos? 1:24. Therefore God gave them up to uncleanness, to the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. They exchanged the truth of God for the lie. And I take that to mean they went off and they worshipped Baal, the lie. and worshipped and served the creature rather than the creator, the creature being a created deity. 126, for this reason God gave them up unto vile passions. And so in short, I don't think Romans 1 is just talking about the general sinfulness of mankind. We knew that, and we don't have to wait this far in the biblical story to know that. We're talking about in fact, here's how I'd say it. My fellow Jews long ago joined the pagan Gentile nations in, well, becoming thoroughly pagan, especially in the worship of created deities. We did not start where we eventually found ourselves, and that is idolaters, just as the Gentiles.